All right, so as Sean said, I'm a research mathematician working in New York City, and I was teaching this spring at Eugene. I'm a part-time faculty member at Eugene Lang College, which is part of the New School, which is a big research university in New York. I was teaching a course this semester. It was a new course already, so it was like flying by the seat of my pants constructing a course from scratch this spring. And, you know, when in mid-March, when everything happened, the new school also went online. The week of March 9th was a very, you know, dramatic week, because at the beginning of that week, it was like life was still, I don't know if it was like this in South Africa, but in New York, it was like the beginning of the week of March 9th, life was still normal. The end of that week was when the Apple stores in the United States said they were closing. And then the next week was when New York City really started shutting down. But that was the week when universities started announcing that they would be shutting down. So there was, and it happened to coincide with spring break for us. The following week was spring break. So it was like, we're going to go online after spring break. And then it was like, wait, no, we're actually going to cancel classes that Friday. And my class happened to be teaching on a Friday. So I didn't see my students for about a month because of just how the things lined up. So I'm giving you this just a little, I'm painting a picture, a little bit of the context of my spring, which is where the question that this talk is focused on emerged from. So, okay, so basically, I had a moment in mid-March where I was like, okay, what are we doing? I don't know if you all felt this way too, but you know, New York was rapidly becoming the global epicenter of the health crisis, and I happened to also be a little sick. So I thought maybe I had a mortal illness, or you know, and my wife was too, and you know, it's like a whole. So all this is happening at the same time. School is shutting down, society is shutting down, and I'm, you know, dealing with my own personal connection to the situation, and like I'm sure all of you, also worried about everybody in my community who was potentially particularly vulnerable. And so in thinking about what was going to happen in the rest of the semester, this was all shaping it. So this is the next things that happened were my university announced that it was going to give us a week off after the spring break to study the affordances and capacities of the online technology that we had, so we can figure out how to do our courses. And it also announced a grading policy where students would get either an A or A minus, or an incomplete, or an informal withdrawal, which is a grade that that university uses only when a student just like stops showing up to class completely. So the university made a strong decision to acknowledge the situation in the grading policy, which I don't think every university did, but some. And also, in addition to that, there was a very robust conversation in my department by email that was sensitive to the very unusual circumstances and the unusual demands it was placing on students. And you know, I am also a person who uses social media, and I follow a lot of graduate students and faculty members on Twitter. So I had access via Twitter to people speaking very subjectively about the challenges of the situation for themselves. So that tuned me into like, this is, you know, a hardship. I mean, obviously my own situation also tuned me into that. But that was going on. And so I was very like conscious in when the transition was happening of the fact that this whole situation was totally bad. And, you know, it was sort of unreasonable of any of us to ask normal things of ourselves or each other. So during the study week that followed spring break, when we were figuring out how we were going to teach our classes online, I gave my students a survey, just checking in with them about where their head was at. And something that emerged from that survey, unsurprisingly, was that some students were really freaked out and, you know, personally impacted and just thrown off their game by what was happening. But another thing that a little bit surprised me, because it wasn't frankly where my head was at, that emerged from the survey, was that some students were bored and isolated and looking for a sense of connection and something to do, and really wanted the knowledge I had promised to them in the course. So those two things sort of those were opposite sets of needs. The students are just like I can't deal, and other students who are like, please give me something to do. And you know, I felt as an instructor sort of pulled on in opposite directions by those two sets of needs. But what I landed on in the context of everything that I've just described, including my own sort of, you know, freaked outness about my own situation, was the rest of this course is going to be offered, not imposed. And I'm going to read to you from an email that I sent my students, this, you know, kind of like into the first week of class, or I forget exactly when, but I definitely like spent several days composing this email. Just to frame this offered, not imposed idea in a little more detail. I was speaking about the grading policy that the university had gone to, which, by the way, there was also a student strike that was announced, because even though the university did that, a lot of students felt like the university wasn't doing enough to accommodate the crazy situation they were in. It wasn't refunding fees for services that students were going to no longer be able to access, et cetera. So there was a student strike announced, and after the student strike was announced, the university went to a policy where they even threw out the incomplete and unofficial withdrawal grades. So everybody was getting an A or A-. So in that context, I wrote to my students, this presents me as an instructor with the rare opportunity to work with you in a context where we can focus on the learning, because the grades have already more or less been dealt with. I'm taking this as a kind of gift, and I invite you to do so as well. The real purpose of education is the ideas and skills we're focusing on. Grades are a mechanism that the institution of education uses to organize various people's priorities and also the allocation of various resources, but they are fundamentally external to the process of encountering new ideas and learning new skills. Receiving feedback is integral to that process, but useful feedback can easily take forms other than grades, such as specific actionable suggestions to improve your work. As I'm sure you've already noticed, this is my favorite kind of feedback to give. The university's grading policy for the semester gives us a little reprieve from the ordinary requirement that our interactions over your work be mediated by the dynamic of you need to do this for the grade. I'm assigning the work because I think you will learn interesting, beautiful, and powerful things by doing it. I invite you to approach the work from this same point of view. So this was something I came to as a result of these crazy circumstances. But landing on that and shaping the entire second half of the class out of a principled stand to offer, not impose, the rest of the class made me reflect on the role of coercion in teaching all the time. You know, like this was this crazy thing that we all did this last semester. It was weird, you know, it was unprecedented. But it clarified for me that students have needs and demands on them that make that it's not my place to decide that my class is more important than those needs and demands. And it was in the context of this situation where that was very clear, you know, like I was like, I could barely, you know, I have to do so much more work to take care of my basic needs now that society is shutting down than I did before. It's unreasonable to ask me to do X, Y, and Z. It's certainly unreasonable to ask that of my students. So the context made that very clear, but I don't think it's, you know, once that happened, it sort of shook out for me. When is that ever not true? When do I ever, on what basis really do I ever have the right to decide that what I want my students to do is more important than what they think they need to do for their own wellness or whatever purpose they decide they need to do it for. And the truth is that the conditions of teaching in the pandemic also clarified that, because we had less control over our students than, than under normal circumstances when they're physically with us. And this resonates with a lot of Mika's comments earlier, and in particular a question, somebody asked Mika a question about cheating, and I think that really puts this into focus, because there was a lot of anxiety. I saw it on social, discussions of that type of thing on social media too, about, well, now that students are not in the room with us, how do we make sure they're not cheating? And it's like, we have to trust them. We can try to do some hacks with the technology, but the technology has separated us from the distance has separated us from the tools we usually use to control what students do. So we actually have to, we don't have a choice. We have to trust them. And that was kind of revolutionary. Like, a lot of people were just like, okay, how do we claw back control? Like the College Board, there was a whole thing, I don't know the details of this story, but you can look it up. There was a thing with the College Board and the AP tests in, are they gonna, how are they gonna enforce good behavior on the AP tests? And the whole thing just sort of seemed ridiculous to me. Like, you're not in a position to enforce that. The students are not with you. So now that we have this little experiment in not having control over our students, and a little experiment in realizing that their needs are important, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to, after this is all over, are we going to go back to just like, okay, no, we're allowed to impose our will on students whenever, we're allowed to decide that what we think is important for them is more important than what they think is important for them, just like we did before without thinking about it? This pandemic seems to me to be an opportunity to reflect on the place of coercion in teaching, when we kind of, both through the way that the technology forces us to have less control over them, and through the fact that the pandemic made it so morally clear that in this specific set of circumstances, it was inappropriate to do certain coercive things that we would normally do to try to get them to do what we wanted. Those things are, I guess I'm saying those questions, the thing that my talk here is offering you is that those questions have been raised regardless of the pandemic. So I'll end there. So I'm not making a claim that they can't. They totally could. So, but I personally, I'm just saying I'm using the opportunity, and invite you all to use the opportunity of the occasion that we had to be forced to like cut our students some slack and give them grace, to carry that forward into, in sort of whatever way it makes sense to you to think that through. For me personally, I've already been interested for a number of years in mastery-based grading, also sometimes known as standards-based grading, which is where the grade, you just decide on some specific learning outcomes of the form, like students are going to be able to do this, or they're going to understand this, and then the grade is completely based on the extent to which they meet those standards, as assessed through any number of different, you can use tests for it, but you can also use, any other form of thing. And rather than averaging students' grades on particular pieces of work throughout the semester, which is the standard thing to do, the grade is just, if you demonstrate learning on one of my outcomes by the end of the semester, even though I assessed it at the beginning of the semester, it doesn't matter that you didn't have it at the beginning of the semester if you got it by the end, and that kind of thing. So I've already been interested in forms of grading that let go somewhat of like using, for example, grading homework to enforce students doing homework. That grading system puts me in a position where I'm not actually seeing how much homework you did at all when I do my grades. So, and one illustration of what kind of the experiment that my talk was about is even though I've been using this grading system for a few years now, which means that I'm not gonna look at how much homework you did when I'm only gonna look at my various assessments of did you meet my standards and for what you needed to be able to do, like can you do X mathematical thing, not did you do 30% of your homework or 70% of your homework or 80% of your homework. Like that's irrelevant to my grading. So even though that was irrelevant to my grading, I've been sort of shy to tell students that. Like I tell them, but I don't put a fine point on it. I don't make a big deal of it. I have not historically stressed to my students that I wasn't going to be looking at their homework when I did their, at their homework completion rates when they did their grades. And the reason I was never stressed that was because I want them to do their homework. I want them to do all of it. I want to be able to get on their case about it if they don't and have them feel like that's a real thing that they should care about. And it always struck me as a tiny bit manipulative that I didn't come out louder with the fact that my grading system implied that I wasn't looking at that. And the pandemic teaching that I did this last semester really kind of clarified for me that I was being like I was holding on to a piece of coercion from a previous grading system that I had abandoned. That was like the threat of the impact on your grade of not doing your homework is a way I can use to get you to do your homework. So I'm really, my talk was really about how we are thinking about it. It wasn't about concrete steps, and what the concrete steps are for you are going to be different from what the concrete steps are for me. I'm interested in forms of grading that feel like they're really about, I mean, the truth is I kind of hate grades. Maybe you could tell that from my talk, I don't know. But I always did, but I'm interested in kinds of grading that, given that I have to give grades, that are like as focused and specific and like it's easy to interpret what they mean. Like an A means you can do X, Y, Z, and W, and not like some kind of concoction and cocktail. I'm probably talking much longer than I feel like stopping because I just feel like I talked a long time just now, but that's what I have to say, Sophie. Thanks for the question.